And we're live. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us again. My name is Cecil Phillip, and what you're watching now is on .NET Live, where we talk about all the great stuff that our community is working on in the .NET ecosystem. Now, I'm particularly excited about today's episode because, one of the things that I've decided I wanted to do this year was I wanted to learn a couple of things. And on that list of things for me to learn how to do was Blazor. So this month on .NET Live TV, we've been having tons of folks from the community talk to us about like the different work that they've been doing, libraries they've been working on, projects that they have, all focused on Blazor. So today, my buddy Rodney here is going to talk to us about reactive UI and how we can build like, reactive type applications using the framework using Blazor. So I'm really excited about it. Rodney, why don't you introduce yourself really quickly and just tell folks who you are and what do you do?
So I'm Rodney Littles II. I've been a .NET developer for lots of years, since the 1.0 version of the framework. I won't tell you the number of years, I'll tell you since the framework version. So I date back to the 1.0 version of the framework. My first ever project was converting a ASP Classic app to .NET 1.0. And move forward into service-oriented architectures, which is basically just microservices before any of the CI/CD stuff happened. And then further on in my career, I decided to get into the mobile space. So I became a Xamarin developer. 2016 Evolve, Mike Stonis was on stage talking about build better mobile apps with reactive extensions. I've jumped in and I haven't found my way back out since.
Nice. It's funny because I remember, years ago, like I think that I went to the last Xamarin Evolve. I think that was in Orlando. And I think in that moment, I was like so excited about all the stuff that was happening in the mobile space. I went and bought myself a Mac. Again, this is, I wasn't at Microsoft at the time. I was working for different companies. But I'm like, I want to do this mobile thing. And I went and bought myself a Mac just so I could start building mobile applications. And it was just like such an exciting thing that was happening at the time. And now with Maui that's coming out later this year, like now I'm getting that itch again. I'm like, I stepped away from mobile and I started looking at this cloud thing and the serverless thing and, web APIs and things of that nature. But now I'm like, oh, Maui's coming out. Maybe I need to start doing this mobile stuff again, right? So like, I get it, man. Sometimes you get that itch and you're like, you know what? Like I gotta jump in, right? I gotta do this thing.
Yeah, and Maui is really exciting in my opinion because it really marks the beginning of a whole new world for mobile development in the .NET space, right? Because Microsoft acquired Xamarin, which was built on C# technologies to deliver cross-platform mobile applications, and now it's going to be in the system namespace. It's very exciting that Maui is coming down the pipeline because now it really is like that one .NET vision, right? Where you can build in one place and deploy pretty much everywhere.
Right. And I'm sure some of the technology that we're going to talk about today with reactive UI and reactive extensions kind of plugs into that really well. But before we do that, right, before we start talking about that, two things we got to do. One, I got to acknowledge all the folks that are in the community that are watching us, that are joining us from different parts of the world. Always want to make sure that we give everyone a shout out. Again, I'm looking in the chat right now. I can see we have some folks from Turkey and from Romania. I know Turkey and Romania shows up every week. I swear to God, like every week.
Nice.
So definitely appreciate y'all being here. I see some folks in here as well from India. I see some folks in here from South America, from Canada. Again, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate you. If I didn't call your country, please don't get mad at me. I know sometimes like, we gotta get back to the show, right? Like I can't be looking at the chat all the time. But wherever you are, whatever time zone you're calling in from, see, here we go now. Ethiopia, Montana. See, this is what I'm talking about. We have people from Barbados coming in from the Caribbean. Always appreciate our Caribbean people. Germany, Argentina. Okay, yeah. Colombia. Here we go. See what I told you, man.
I love it.
Love it.
But that really just kind of shows the whole, .NET really is all over the world.
Exactly. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to share some links really quickly. Let's just go through some updates and then we can start diving into reactive UI, right?
Sounds good.
So I'm going to bring my screen up. And so the first link I want to share is actually our episode from last week. So like I mentioned, we're doing Blazor like all this entire month of June. And last week we had Chris Sainty on, and I think Chris is in London, I believe. So he called in and he was on the show and spoke to us about how we could set up like Tailwind CSS inside of our Blazor applications. Now, it's really cool because for me, again, I'm not a CSS pretty designer person, like that's just not my thing. But, I still got to build apps, right? I still want them to look kind of okay. And, he showed us how like we could really sit down and configure Tailwind, configure the build system, how we could plug that into MS Build and some of the hot reload features that are coming out in .NET 6. So that was definitely very cool. So if you want to, I'm going to share these links in the chat. Definitely make sure you check out the episode we had last week on building beautiful Blazor apps with Tailwind CSS. Next link I want to share, my buddy David Pine wrote a really cool article on Dev2. And this is talking about why build single page apps in Blazor. Now, I think this is pretty timely, right? Because a lot of folks are like, Blazor is still new. I don't know if it's mature enough yet. I don't know who uses it. I don't know what the limitations are. And those are fair questions to ask, right? Like, I think anyone that's adopting a new thing has questions. So I think, excuse me, I think David does a really good job at answering some of these questions in this blog post. And again, I'll share this link in the chat. So, definitely give it a read, and hopefully you'll, kind of see what he's saying and, try out Blazor. And the last thing I want to share with you tomorrow, so June 25th at 8 a.m. Pacific time, right? So 8 a.m. Pacific time, that'll be about 11 Eastern Standard Time. Actually, it's 8:30, so it'll be 8:30 a.m. Pacific time, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be doing a Let's Learn.net event where we'll be focusing on Blazor. So I believe it's going to be our friends Jamie Singleton and also Jeff Fritz. They're going to be going through some Blazor Learn modules. Again, this will be live, so it'll be live Q&A. You can get your questions answered. And if you're new to Blazor, this is a great place for you to come and just come hang out with the team, get some questions answered, and see what it actually feels like to build Blazor applications. But, we're going to build some Blazor applications today too, but we're going to do something else though. We're going to do something really cool and build them with Reactive UI. So what I'm going to do, what I always do, is I'm going to take my screen off because this is no longer my show. Now it's the Rodney show. Now Rodney's going to let us know what exactly it takes to build stuff with Reactive UI. And I'm thinking,
definitely take my keyboard away because I'm not quite right.
we're about to get in, right? We're about to dive into it.
Let's do it.
So why don't we just start off with the basics, right? What exactly is Reactive UI?
Oh, okay. So let's start with what Reactive UI is not. Reactive UI is not React.js. It is not React Native. It is not, any of the JavaScript frameworks that you hear about it. Reactive UI, branding aside, is actually a MVVM framework. And I even call it a framework with air quotes. It's an MVVM offering that allows you, that kind of gives you lift building MVVM. Right? So you get the power of the reactive extensions, which, we'll talk about in a little bit, what those are, but you get the power of reactive extensions and you get some MVVM goodness on top of that.
Got it. Okay. So if I'm familiar with reactive extensions, then Reactive UI should kind of make sense to me. But what if I'm new to both of them? Like, how easy is it or difficult is it? Or like, what's the learning curve for me to just start plugging these things into my app?
So it's funny because someone asked me on Twitter that exactly, right? So the learning curve is steep, and I think that's the hardest part to getting people involved in Reactive UI. Reactive UI is based on reactive extensions. Reactive extensions is based on iObservable interface, which is in the system namespace. Yep. What does that mean? That means that instead of dealing with pull-based collections like IEnumerable, I go to the server and I go get an IEnumerable of data and then I bring it back. I'm dealing with an iObservable, which is really more like a stream of data. Sure. So the hardest part about Reactive UI, and people always come in, I mean, I personally did it, right? I didn't know anything about reactive extensions when I started. They come in looking for an MVVM offering and they immediately get tripped up by the fact that it's all based on top of this harder to understand technology in the .NET space. So that's like really the hard part about it. But once you get over the learning curve itself, I mean, the payoff is huge because in reality, you're not learning an MVVM framework more as you're flipping the way you reason about how you write your code. And we're going to talk about that a lot more once we get to dig into the samples.
Sure. And I guess I'd add to that. So I'm not a reactive extensions or reactive UI expert, but I would say the way I kind of look at it is like, imagine like you build your application backwards, if that makes sense. So if you think about how you, hey, I need to get information, like I'm going to ask for it, I'm going to go and I'm going to pull it, right? Like give me another one and give me another one and like get, like you're, again, like you're iterating through an array or you're attaching to an event, like give me stuff, right? Versus the other way, reactive programming is kind of like, well, let me know when things happen, right? Like push events to me, push notifications to me, let me know when things are going on. And then we're doing it backwards, right? Like I'm not asking for it, you're telling me. And then once you tell me, then I'll code will figure out what we're supposed to do when these things arrive. So would you say, is that fair? Like, is it kind of like that?
That's extremely accurate. So it's so to make it a little bit closer to home, we're talking about the imperative programming model versus the declarative programming model, right? Imperative means that I, the developer, write the code and tell the code what to do, and it goes and does it. What we're really doing with Reactive UI is we're setting up a series of state listeners, for lack of a better term, right? Okay. We are listening for the application to be in a specific state. And when the application reaches that state, this code that has been written will fire off in that time. So that's kind of the hard part in the learning curve, because debugging is a little bit harder because it's inherently asynchronous, right? Because it's not happening right there where I write the code. It's happening kind of at the right time based upon a whole bunch of other factors. But because of that, it actually becomes a lot easier to scale your application as requirements change. So I don't know if anybody else is a professional developer that has POs that change their requirements every week. But if you are, reactive extensions is an amazing tool for dealing with that complexity and shifting the complexity out of the technology itself. And you can really just answer the business problem a lot simpler.
Sure. And then we have some questions and comments coming in here right now from YouTube. Sure. This one person says, this reminds me of the Hollywood principle. Don't call us, we'll call you, kind of thing.
So that's actually a great idea or a great way to explain it. That's exactly what it is, right? Hollywood will call you when you've got a hit, right? So yeah, exactly that. When you've got a hit, they'll pick up the phone, they'll send the notification, and then your code will light up and do the things that it's supposed to do.
Sure. And then this next person here is saying, so React UI, I'm guessing he means Reactive UI, is available in Blazor WebAssembly, and that's what we're going to talk about today, right? Like that's the show is all about.
What we're talking about today. Yep.
So why don't we, Rodney? Why don't we go ahead and like look at some samples? Like I want to see it, right? Like show me how the thing works.
Are we showing my screen right now? Because I'm lost.
We are showing your screen now.
Perfect.
Now your screen is up.
So. So we're going to get into the code in a second, but I just kind of want to cover some links of my own. This is Reactive UI's handbook. This is the foremost place for all documentation that we have on Reactive UI. There is, and it can be still hard to understand. So we're always looking to improve. So all of this is publicly accessible on GitHub. You can go and put an issue on our website repo and tell us that this doesn't make sense or your documentation is wrong or what have you, and we'll get it cleaned up and fixed up. But this is a great place for you to go ahead and get started with understanding the MVVM concerns around it. And of course, it's a full GitHub project. Pointing out to the person that asked the question, Reactive UI is available all of these places that you see here. So Universal Windows, WPF, WinForms, Xamarin Forms, Xamarin Android, Xamarin iOS, Xamarin Mac, Tizen, Blazor, Uno, Avalonia UI. Like we support all of these places. And I really want to point out that this is one of the things that drew me to Reactive UI was the fact that it didn't just support Xamarin Forms, right? Like I'm a Xamarin developer. I started right around the time that Forms became a thing. So I remember Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android. And the fact that it supports all of these frameworks means we can support some of your legacy applications, and all of them can kind of use the same MVVM bits and goodness without too much of a hassle.
Got it.
So let's jump into some code and let's talk about some concepts, right? So digging into this code example here, what you'll notice at the very top, or let's go ahead and kind of start from the beginning. I think is probably the better way to do it. Once I can find my Explorer, perfect. So over here, We've got our Blazor server-side application. I will say that it works with Blazor server-side. It works with Blazor client, and I want to say ASP.NET hosted. There are examples and samples out there available on ReactiveUI's GitHub offering, so feel free to go look at those. But today I elected to use Blazor server-side because it was the easiest for me to pick up and use, being somebody that's kind of new to Blazor and hasn't really been around the web much. It was very, very easy for me to jump in.
Cool.
But I do want to kind of point something out real quick. One of the questions that we get quite often is, oh, which NuGet package am I supposed to? Oh goodness, here we go. What NuGet package am I supposed to use? So I want to point out that when you go and pull in Reactive UI to your application, depending upon what target you're using, you want to pull that target in to the target you're hitting. So notice this is a Blazor server-side application. So I'm using ReactiveUI.Blazor 14.41 just dropped like 2 nights ago. So I haven't updated to the latest bits. Shame on me. But this kind of gives you an understanding of this is all it takes from a NuGet package perspective. And I like to look at it in the XML, so I apologize if that offends anyone. But this is all it takes to get started, right? You just go ahead and you can do a quick, .NET new template, which is exactly what I did. And you include ReactiveUI.Blazor, pull in the latest version, and you're off to the races.
Nice. And then just real quick for folks, because I know someone's going to ask this question. So I see you're using Netcore 3.1. I'm guessing Reactive UI is a net standard package, so I could use it in my .NET 5 applications and hopefully .NET 6 whenever .NET 6 comes out.
Yes, so I'm a finicky developer, and I've had some issue with .NET 5 breaking some of my legacy Xamarin stuff. So I elect not to use Net 5 sometimes when I'm doing samples, only because it plays better with my with my Xamarin stuff. But sure, yeah, you can use this for .NET 5. As a matter of fact, we support .NET 5, and we're starting to work on the Maui offerings here in the next couple of weeks.
Awesome.
Yep. So that is a good call out. So one of the main things that I want to continue to point out is, Blazor has this concept of this state changed, right? So this is a very MVU concept, right? So let's talk about like MVU versus MVVM. MVU is like that model view update concept, right? So we're really like on a single thread where we get some change and then we update the view and then we go back and we get some change and we update the view and we go back, and it's kind of a single threaded concept. To use a bad analogy, like some of the other MVU frameworks are using like a single event loop type of threading system for their MVU offerings. And in Blazor, that concept is surfaced and in this state has changed object. So you'll notice this is the component base. Here we go. I have a decompiler, so I vigorously F12 into code and look at other people's code because it's like one of my favorite pastimes. So you'll notice that this is the component base that is delivered from Blazor, and we are actually in Reactive UI, and this is the UI aspect of Reactive UI. One of the offerings that Reactive UI provides is, and again, this is ReactiveUI.Blazor. We provide extensions for the majority of the UI frameworks UI offering in Reactive UI. And to talk about that briefly is this iView4 interface. What that does is give us a type safe, full fidelity view model to bind to for our binding engine, because Reactive UI was kind of created before XAML was the way of doing things. So for legacy frameworks like Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android, we have C# binding offerings, and they all are based on this iView4 concept. And what that does is that provides us a view model. Notice it's a parameter T view model that we can bind our stuff to. And this is kind of the meat and potatoes of how we bridge the gap between MVU and MVVM. If I can find the constructor, because that's where all the fun stuff is. Or I guess it's not. It's actually in the on after render. I remember that. So this is where Blazor gets kind of weird, right? So generally what you will do in reactive extensions and Reactive UI is you will declare all of your pipelines, all of your observable pipelines, all of your behaviors in the constructor. But what ends up happening in Blazor is you kind of have to do some of it in this on after render and play around with some of that stuff because of the way the injection happens. With Blazor is not a constructor injection concept. So it's all still the same. You're really going to put all of your in your view models. You're going to put it in your constructor. But here we're putting it we're putting it in the on after render. And what we're doing here for you as the framework is we're saying, hey, when the view model gets changed, right, just go ahead and change the state. So that means that if you change your binding, if you change your view model that's bound to your view, let's say I want to, hot swap my view model at any given point, that change will get picked up and we will automatically trigger this state has changed for you. So what we're doing is we're using the iNotify property change concept that you know and love from MVVM to trigger the change in your MVU platform. And that's a very big thing. So that's really like the UI aspect of Reactive UI. Everything else about Reactive UI could technically just be called like Reactive MVVM and pulled out into its own bits, because that's kind of what they are. They're just kind of ways to use iNotify property change as an observable. And kind of what do I mean by that? So like, let's talk about like iObservable here for a second, and you'll notice that this thing returns iObservable. I'm going to change this. Actually, I can't change that right there. So I'll change it. I'll dig into my view model here and I'll set a value so that you guys can see what I'm talking about.
Sure. And then actually, while you're doing that, or before you do that, so just to like recap really quick, because I know sometimes we have folks that like, aren't familiar with a lot of these terms and stuff. So from my understanding, like the purpose of the view model is to hold the state, right? Or the values or the data, however we want to look at it, for like the UI that we're looking at, for the interface we're looking at, for the controls and the buttons and, like the things that we interact with, right? Like it's holding information about like the page. If, for example, we're talking about a page or a component, right?
Yeah. So go ahead.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so then for Reactive UI, when you have a reactive view model, pretty much, because what you mentioned pipeline, when you talk about pipeline, you're saying, hey, whenever things change in my data, this is what you want you to do, or this is what I want my code to do. And then you declare that in a reactive pipeline, which would be different from saying I'm going to attach to an event or do like a change handler or something like that.
It is and it's not, and I think that's the main thing, right? So talking about specifically the view model concept for a quick second. So I'll answer both questions in kind. The view model concept is exactly that, right? We are dealing with state. There was a white paper done some years ago on this, and what the software engineers realized is that the hardest part of complexity in any application we write is mutable state, right? This thing changed, and I need to go do something as a result of that change, right? That's the hardest part of application development. So what MVVM does is gives you a two-way binding, it gives you a two-way binding surface between your view and what we call a view model, which holds application state. Then that application state will update your domain. So if you're in like domain-driven design, right, you'll have domain objects that will get updated, and then those domain objects will get persisted to the database, and the application kind of flows in that concept. Where MVU is different is that it's one continuous event loop. So kind of bridging those two things together, right? Instead of doing everything in your code behind, right? What we're doing is we're giving you in a Blazor application the ability to create a view model and get all of the MVVM niceties around state management in Blazor.
Got it. That makes sense. I got you now. Now we got a quick question coming in here from YouTube. Panos is asking, is view model activated? I'm guessing that's the event that will get fired. Is view model activated executed on after render?
If you're talking about like the Reactive UI iActivatable view model, or iActivatable interface, there we go. Rodney's good at this. I'm not 100% sure that we are handling when activated in Blazor. So I'm not 100% sure. I don't think we are. So I don't think that your when activated would work. And that's kind of be the weird part is the question is, is Blazor ready for prime time, right? That's the question that I draft probably all the time. The reality of it is that because it's because it's MVU and MVVM together, there are some quirks. So that is one of those things that is going to be different on the Blazor platform than it is going to be on like your Xamarin or your WPF platform.
Okay. And then we have another question. So this person's saying, I've used Blazor UI. So Blazor UI is like a components like UI interface. It has controls and things of that nature, right? So it says, I've used Blazor UI in Blazor and clean architecture. It says UI is very easy to implement and it's fully developed in C#. What is the features of Reactive UI and how fast can we implement them in Blazor? All right, so I guess, well, that's what we're here to talk about, right? So I think that's what we're going to try and answer. You know, how exactly can we add these things? So, and just as also as a just to clarify, Mud Blazor, what you're asking about, again, that's about controls and UI elements and things of that nature. Reactive UI, at least as far as I know, does not offer controls. It's more so code that allows you to react to different events and, you know, like Rodney was saying, you know, set up your view models in a certain way.
But to briefly answer that question, you can use the Blazor binding engine, and we'll see that here in a second because I'm using like Matte Blazor, so just so that I could use a control that wasn't, you know, stocking out of the box. But I am using some of those things. But it's really just you're going to use the Blazor binding engine, and you just have to set up your events correctly. And it's really about event management. That's exactly what we're going to get into talking about here next. So that's a great segue, right? Because what this thing here is a when any value. And it's basically projecting iNotify property change event, right? So we're taking our iNotify property change event and we're converting it, and we're projecting what is called an iObservable. So it's basically a stream of data. So I like to look at iObservable, and this is in its most basic form, as link over events, right? So you have link to SQL, you have link to objects, you have link to all of these other things. Reactive extensions, in my opinion, is no more than link to events, and not events like .NET events, although it does cover that. That's the subset, right? The superset is you can use iObservable to tie .NET eventing system, the .NET TPL, iObservable, and pretty much anything else you want into one consistent API surface. And that's a really big sell to somebody like me who doesn't want to have to deal with asynchronous programming differently than I deal with multi-threading, than I deal with all of these other concerns. I don't want to have to worry about wiring up my event handler in the correct place and then disposing of the event handler, because by default, when you subscribe to an iObservable, you are returned an iDisposable, which can be immediately garbage collected. So whereas the TPL doesn't necessarily give you the same disposability or garbage collection, interaction. If you can convert a task to an iObservable and then dispose of it when it's completed. So that's a kind of a very big thing that we can kind of play around with.
Got it.
But it just kind of shows that I'm taking this search text event. Well, I guess it's really not showing that. It's showing a little bit further upstream, but I can show you that taking this event, right, will basically just replace the one occurrence, right, is giving me a value on this search text. Let me stop this over here. So what's happening here is I've got this search text field, right, that does my raise and set of change. This is my MVVM stuff, right? So this is my MVVM view model, and it's going to raise a property change notification. I notify property change. No real magic there from any specific angle, right? But what I'm allowed to do with the reactive extensions that Reactive UI provides is say, anytime a value ticks on this concern, give me that value. So to your point, right, I can say, hey, anytime that they enter in a particular, let's say we had like a word of the day concept, right? Anytime they type in the word of the day, the UI could, fire off lightning bolts, right? Like those are things that are possible just because you have this pipeline. And because you have this pipeline, you can reason about it in any manner of ways. I.e., you see normal link syntax that you're used to using, right? Where, skip, select, all normal operators and enumerable are, I'm not going to use that term because I'm going to get it wrong. I always get that one wrong.
They're like cousins.
They're like cousins. I think there's there's a monad in there somewhere, but I'm always bad with monads, so I won't get into the details. That's kind of like the gist of what Reactive UI provides and kind of the sell as to why you would want to use it. If you'll notice, I am here in my search view model, right? And in my search view model, I am declaring all of the behaviors of what this application or what this view model does. I'm going to go ahead and collapse this constructor real quickly to show you that that's less than 30 lines of code, and that's pretty much the entire class, right? Everything else is just setting up properties and one extemporaneous method call. So there's no, big method that calls a whole bunch of other methods that I have to then go reason about. There's no 5 levels deep of having to go from this method to that method. And I only call it in this state and in this state. None of that happens, right? Everything is very succinct. It's declared in my view model constructor. So when I need to reason about the behavior of this view model, all I have to do is go to the most important function in the view model, i.e. the constructor, and look at how is this thing programmed to behave and under what circumstances will it do its job.
Got it. And I kind of want to go back to one of the questions that someone asked earlier, which was around like, how hard is it to learn? Pretty much, I'm paraphrasing the question, but that's pretty much the question. Right? Like, how hard is this thing to learn? And as we're looking at the code, a couple of things come to mind. I think, obviously, if you're familiar with C#, that's kind of prerequisite. But if you're familiar with Link, like this code looks very readable and very like approachable, right? Like again, I use Link almost every time I write .NET applications, right? Skip, where, select, like these all look pretty much like they make sense. I'm guessing like Reactive UI probably adds one or two additional operators and things of that nature.
Yes.
And then also, like you mentioned, instead of working on enumerables and I list of things and I collection of things, where you're working with I observables and I observers, right? Which again, like you said, they're kind of like cousins, right? But like that's the main difference. So for me, it's almost like, the complexity is just going somewhere else. Because like you mentioned just now, like you collapse the constructor. Outside of the constructor, nothing else is really going on other than like, here are the properties, right? Like here are, view model dot first name, view model dot last name kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'll even go further to say that had I used Reactive UI FODI, which I didn't do, I could reduce the entire set of lines of code by even more, right? So this entire view model could potentially be only 60 lines of code.
Right. All right, we got a bunch more questions coming in, so let's see what folks are asking. More questions coming in from YouTube. Yandel is asking, does Reactive UI bridge the gap on notifying other components like pub sub? So I'm guessing he's asking if you have multiple components and not necessarily just like parent and child, but like, let's say they're all siblings, can we notify each other and be like, here, this thing happened and that thing happened?
Yeah, you could. So in this, right? So just using a quick contrived example like this iDuckDuckGo service, let's assume for a moment that this is a single instance in my application, and it has some, I can search observable, right? I observable bool, I can search. I could inject this into every single view model, and every view model would get that update when that observable ticks. So the concept of I observable and the concept of reactive extensions is basically the observer pattern implemented in C#. So it basically is pub sub. And how you reason about it becomes easier once you accept the fact that I can have a singleton service that can project out information to any consumer, any listener in my entire application.
Awesome. So then, as an example, if I had sibling components, my sibling could listen to my view model as an example, or subscribe to changes on my view model and react to stuff that happens.
Yes.
You don't need it.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Next question before I let you move on really quick. Blazor bindings will not affect application performance. That's the question. So I'm guessing the question is, with Reactive UI, how does it affect the performance of your Blazor application?
I would think that it wouldn't do anything more than the .NET event itself, right? So like if you had a text changed event that got triggered and you had to listen to it, an iObservable is not much more on top of that. It's so like let's take the lazy loading, right? Adding lazy to an object allocates an extra 8 bits of memory, right? Something ridiculously simple like that. We're talking about minuscule amounts of problems. Where you will run into performance issues is if you're doing a lot of complex pipeline stuff and you're not paying attention to when pipelines are firing off. That's a much more advanced. To answer that at another time, but I don't want to get into the concept of hot and cold observables today because I'll lose myself.
Sure, no problem. All right, cool. Let's keep going.
Cool. So this is kind of like the meat and potatoes of this, right? I have this search view model, and again, people tell me all the time, Rodney, the search example is overdone. It's too much. Like you need to find another example. And I'm like, yeah, but the search example, it works. And I kind of took a different spin on the search example today. So just kind of showing some of to answer some of the questions around some of the Blazor bits, right? I've got this Blazor page here where I've got my reactive component base. I've got some card views on here, which we're supposed to wire up to SignalR, but I broke SignalR last night. So sorry, folks, you don't get to see the awesomeness of that is, but I can kind of talk through what that would be. And you'll notice that this is just a simple input, and I'm using my Blazor bindings to bind the value to the search text. I'm using my Blazor bindings to bind whether or not this button is disabled based upon the view model being able to be able to clear. And I'm also outputting some information to the screen based upon whether or not I have search results, right? So you'll see here that this is just a regular Blazor application at this point. The difference is that instead of me writing all the code in this code block, right, I'm explicitly only writing code blocks so that I can call my view model. So now we're getting a clean separation of view concerns from quote unquote view model concerns, which you wouldn't get in an MVU world out of the box. And to me, that's really kind of the beautiful thing here, because I am very much a clean coder where I like to segregate my concerns. I like view concerns to be in the view. I like view model concerns to be in the view model. I like domain to be in domain and data to be data. So the concept of going back towards that ASP classic style of development where I write all my code in the view, it kind of honestly threw me off against Blazor. But then once Reactive UI offered this, I was like, oh, I can just go write my view models the way I'm used to doing, and I can write an application. And now all I have to reason about is the HTML and the bindings. So for me, this is the only way that I would really approach Blazor because it's comfortable for me.
Right. That makes sense. We have a question coming in from YouTube. So Jose's always here every week. So definitely shout out to Jose for being like a loyal viewer of the show. Definitely appreciate you being here, man. Jose's asking, I have an application that uses actors via AKAnet that sometimes updates the UI. So does ReactiveUI work well together with AKA.net? So I don't know if you're familiar with AKA.net. And
I am. I have not used it, but I'll say this at the pain of making a faux pas statement. I'll say that reactive extensions, not specifically Reactive UI, but reactive extensions is my preferred way to handle any type of asynchronous modeled programming, right? So if you're talking about getting in live feed updates from some third-party web server via like SignalR, RX is well suited to handle that. As a matter of fact, the first how I got started in RX, and I should probably tell this joke. I was working on a mobile application that needed real-time events, right? And what the mobile app needed was to get an event from the server and then broadcast out to it was supposed to get an event from the server that was saying, hey, some data has changed. And then it was supposed to make a call to the server to go get that data, to go get whatever data was refreshed. And I plugged in an RX pipeline that was maybe five lines. And when I say lines of code, we're talking about lines of code like this is a line of code, right? Like this is not a line of code, folks. This is a single method call, right? So 5 method calls got me my data from the server, my notification from the server in a real-time manner using .NET events, right? I just wrapped the .NET event in an observable from event pattern, and I changed it into an observable. And then when it met the correct condition based upon whether or not you were listening to the right channel or whether or not you were on the right page in the mobile application, I then went to the data store, updated the data store via HTTP, pulled down the latest bits, and refreshed the UI. So I think that it's the only way that I would personally do it going forward. So much so that I'll show you here in a minute, or I'll show you right now, actually. You saw that we were using refit. One of the cells here, if I can reason about my own code at the moment, it has been a day. Let's see. Yeah, so here we go. I'm using this iDuckDuckGo API client, and you'll notice that this is just a refit client. And I want to shout out to the folks that originally wrote refit and Claire, who maintains refit. Claire Novotny, who is the executive director for the .NET Foundation, maintains do an HTTP request and return an iObservable. So I'm not return. So this code sample is actually not even using the TPL directly to go get the data that it's going to get when we actually watch the example being shown in a little bit. So I just kind of want to point that out that I'm not using any task-based programming. I'm using iObservable for things like asynchrony and thread marshaling to get a very robust experience in my application.
Got it. Okay,
so that's a slight caveat. So just kind of getting into the I'm sorry, did that answer the question, and were there more questions?
No more questions right now, but yeah, that did answer the question, I think.
So again, my view model will get some new state and it will project to my screen that it gets new state. So I'm going to kind of take a quick step back and point out this little hack that I did here that I don't know whether or not is right. Some of my there's a big Reactive UI Blazor community. So reactiveui.net/Slack, join us. There's Rich Bryant has been doing a lot of stuff with Reactive UI and Blazor recently. A lot of amazing stuff. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Blazor stuff has been community driven, which is another great story to tell. But again, pointing out that we're bridging MVU with MVVM. This view model in Reactive UI, we use what's called a reactive object, which is our base extension point for MVVM, and it provides this changed observable. So this basically says any property that changes on the view model will tick a value through here. So what I'm doing in Reactive UI is saying, hey, on my Blazor view, anytime that the view model has changed, throttle the change notifications for half a second, and then update the UI by calling the state change method. So this right here is kind of the bridge between MVVM and MVU. When my view model changes, it's going to tell the Blazor view the state changed, right? So this is kind of the man behind the curtains, as it were, as to how all of this stuff works. And you'll notice that I'm using a operator that is not normal to most people's link repertoire, which is throttle. And this is actually what drew me to reactive extensions, was the ability to say, hey, I don't want to deal with every single change notification. Wait until there's a half of a second between the last notification and the next notification and go run it. If I took that out, right, and I ran this, that means that every single time anything on the view model changed, this would just call state change. And I would probably
just keep firing.
Exactly. I would probably end up timing out my Blazor application because it's just happening every single text change, every single element that changes on the screen. So by doing this, what I'm saying explicitly is, hey, I know I need to update the UI, but I only want to update the UI every half a second. You can play with the number of milliseconds that to kind of dial it into what works for you. But I kind of want to point out that this is a very important piece right here to making all of this MVVU, MVVM stuff work.
Got it.
So go ahead.
So I had a question really quickly. So
Sure.
Specifically in that throttle, and I've kind of seen this as I've read reactive, not reactive UI, but reactive extensions, things in general. I realize the concept of understanding the scheduler is important. You know what I mean? I feel like it's important because I keep seeing it in all the code samples. And like here you're using the throttler, and there you have like an rxapp.main thread scheduler. I'm guessing there's probably more than one scheduler for the mere fact that you had to specify that one, right? Yes. How do I know what scheduler should I use? Or at least when it comes to Blazor, should I always just use that one?
So you actually asked the question I was hoping nobody would ask. So kudos to you, my friend.
You should have told me that before we go straight.
Oh, no. I was prepared for that. So to answer that question, there are technically 4 schedulers that you're going to care about in any given application. There's going to be the main thread, which is generally your UI thread. Although if you're in a console application, you don't have a UI, so okay. Which the UI thread is still, or the main thread is still valid there. You're going to have the task pool scheduler, which is basically saying, hey, go run this on a background thread. You're going to have the immediate scheduler, which says, I don't care about what the rest of the things are doing. Go ahead and execute me right now. And then you're going to have the current thread scheduler, which is basically whatever the thread is currently in context. I'm going to point out here that so in a Blazor application, this is actually one of the outstanding bugs on Reactive UI Blazor right now, is because WASM doesn't have the concept of multiple schedulers right now. It's kind of running all on one scheduler. You kind of have to trick RxApp into knowing what applications. And I actually have an implementation where I abstract this behind an interface for testing purposes. But really what we're doing is we're just saying, hey, use the default WASM scheduler. So whatever WASM provides us from, and this is from system.reactive.concurrency, right? So whatever WASM provides us as their default scheduler, go ahead and use that. And so in context, there's only going to be one thread. So you'll see me use main thread and task pool kind of interchangeably throughout this code sample. And as well as I could probably just get away with putting this directly in there, but I very much like to show off the fact that we have this and that this is available to you. So knowing how to marshal threads, and this kind of gets into the whole asynchronous programming versus thread marshaling, right? When you use the TPL and you do async and await, you are not guaranteed a new thread. I'm going to say that again because this is important. When you use the TPL and you use async and await, you are not guaranteed a new thread. So you could get a new thread or you could not get a new thread. In the RX world, that's not the same, right? RX observables are inherently asynchronous. They are asynchronous by default. And really what we do a lot of the times is marshal you from one thread to the other. So I know that I've got some long running process that I don't want the UI thread to have to deal with. Let me go ahead and run that on the task pool. So that way the UI isn't being hung up in like a WPF or a Xamarin application. You've probably seen it where things are running on the main thread and you go to click on the button and the screen doesn't respond. And then like 5 seconds later, like all 5 taps that you did on the button surface and you're like overload. Well, that's thread scheduling, right? We're in the RX world, we are given very easy extension points to basically say, hey, go run this on whatever thread I see fit.
Got it. That makes sense.
Cool.
So then, and I guess, and also just for clarifying for my sake, so depending on the type of app that you're building, right? So again, WebAssembly versus, I don't know, WinUI or some desktop thing or some service app type thing, I need to think about the thread pools a little bit differently because the programming platform is a little bit different, right? And how they handle those types of, threads and workers are a little bit different.
Right. Well, the good thing and the great thing about it is you can define that on the head that you're on. So if you're on your Blazor head, your RX app.main thread scheduler could act differently than if you're on the Xamarin head, right? So you can define that on the platform that you're actually writing the application against, even if you're reusing the view models from one platform to the other.
Got it. So then I feel like I should stop asking you questions because I'm going to get you in trouble.
I mean, this is your time, sir. So, I want to know. As long as you want me here.
I want to know. You're using Blazor server, right? Versus Blazor WebAssembly for this particular application. So how does the RX thread pool scheduler differ considering that we're really running server side versus running in WebAssembly?
So that's kind of the point, right? That's the WebAssembly concern. Like, so the platform that you're operating on, like iOS has a different
different scheduler,
something dispatch scheduler, something that it implements on its framework. So the UI framework is going to determine scheduling concerns and threading concerns. Reactive UI is not going to dictate that for you.
Got it. Okay.
Yep.
Got it. Cool. All right, let's keep going.
Not a problem. So while we're in here, I'm going to point out something else that people that may be familiar with Reactive UI will say, oh, Rodney, you're not using the service locator. So in Reactive UI, we use this thing called Splat, right? And Splat has a service locator. Yes, I know service location is an anti-pattern. It's not really an anti-pattern. It's a tool. And how you implement that tool, how you use that tool to implement your software becomes the anti-pattern. So
I like that. The
locator isn't the problem. You're the problem.
It's not the code, it's the developer, right? Don't blame the code because the developer wrote it.
Well, the reality is the service location is a tool and it has a use. Now it's the abuse of that tool that gets us in trouble. So I've heard, and personally, I don't particularly care for service location. So I say that, and then I go on to say I don't like service location. I've been an AutoFac person for years. So one of the things that you'll notice here is that I'm registering all of my application against Microsoft dependency injection, right? Like I'm using the Microsoft DI container to register all of my application specific bits. Yeah. And then I'm using an offering from Splat to then take the container that I've constructed. And now anytime that the internal Reactive UI framework needs access to a container, it's going to use the container that you've constructed here. That's a very big sell for someone like me who likes to use I like my interfaces to come from my container. And what that allows me to do is, and I'll point out here in my nice, pretty on initialized, I'm actually in my search page, I'm injecting my search view model, which is all constructed by Microsoft DI. So like I'm not fighting against the Blazor and the Microsoft and the DI system. I'm working with it to then say, hey, go ahead and pull it out of the DI system and assign it to my view model property right here. So that gives me the ability to not have to new up. So like, in years past, you'd have to new up a search view model here, and you have to new up your dependency. You'd have to kind of go down the pure DI route if you wanted to work with Reactive UI. Over the most recent years, to make it more appealing to folks that prefer a true IOC container, we've made these offerings available. So we currently support on Splat, I want to say AutoFact, Dry IOC, Simple Injector, Microsoft Dependency Injection, and all of those are available right now. So I wanted to use, I like Microsoft Dependency Injection. Like I wanted to use the bits that come with it. So I did this specifically to show that I can new up this thing and this will come from my container, and all of this is container registered. There's no magic that I have to do.
Right. And then, like you said, also, like you register all of your services, but it also looks like you register your view model as well, right? So that your view model can play well in that world of constructor injection and be able to pull in some of those services you need.
Yes, that is exactly the case. So I'm registering that view model for that reason, right? It's a transient view model. Maybe it probably should be transient because I guess it's the same across all the various platforms. But yeah, I just go to the container and get my constructed view model and stick it on the page, and I'm good to go. Everything is kind of handled for me. I don't have any hard parts. I don't have to worry about whether or not my locator is being called or any of that, right? Because like, to give you an understanding of what you would have to do in the old world, what you have to do is potentially do locator.current.get service, right? And you have to go get it out and do it that way. Well, I don't have to do that anymore because I can now Reactive UI offers the extensibility to be able to do it in whatever IOC container you want. So it's really kind of like bring your own IOC container. You bring whatever container you like, and we can make it work.
Got it.
So that's a big sell. So we've looked at a lot of code, and we haven't really talked about like the details of what's actually going on. So I think I'm going to kind of bring the code off to the side and kind of run it, and then we're going to show the UI and then kind of talk about how some of that stuff is working.
That's right. I didn't even realize we actually haven't even run the application yet.
We haven't even run the application yet because there's so many questions about RX and Reactive UI. So I'm glad that people are asking questions, and this is an interactive session because me talking doesn't do anybody any good. If no one understands what's going on. So here we go.
Welcome to Bang. There you go. The world's 11th search engine. I love it.
My friend, I fashion myself a comedian in my off time. I go on record as saying that I feel like Microsoft missed a great marketing opportunity, and they should have called Bing Bang. Because then it could have became the verb that everyone used instead of saying I Googled it. You could have been like I banged it, and this is the answer I got. But anyway, maybe that's inappropriate. But so I created a search engine, right? Because I broke it. Oh yeah, I broke it. I created a search engine because I wanted to. Yeah, here we go. I gotta run the stuff. Let me just go ahead and stop this and just run the actual application all the way through, so that way you can go ahead and see it instead of having to deal with breakpoints. I created this search engine because the search example is overdone. Oh, there we go. .NET quit unexpectedly. Oof. Let's go ahead, and this should be working.
At least if we don't have at least one crash, it's not a live show. So, this, and I'm happy it happened at the end. So this is perfect. This is perfect timing.
Right. So because the search example is overdone, and if you go to the Reactive UI website, like our default example is a NuGet package search explorer. I recently did a Prism, or not recently, I recently updated the Prism Reactive UI example for Xamarin Forms to use some additional bits, and it's doing that exact same thing. So you can go out to the Prism library and look at the Forms examples and see what that's going on. But the search example is overdone, so of course I wanted to overdo it all the way. I created my own search engine, right? And I didn't get into the Bing APIs because I wanted to keep it simple. I'm just using DuckDuckGo under the hood, but I've got my nice, pretty search engine where you can just type in whatever you want. So I'm going to point out some things that we looked at earlier that we may not have paid attention to, and we'll go back to the code and kind of talk about how this works. You'll notice that my clear button is disabled at the moment. I can't actually click on it. That's by design, right? That's actually coded for us using Reactive UI. We are binding the Blazor binding to a property on our view model that tells us whether or not this view model is able to search, right? And it's reactive to whether or not there's something in this text box. So the second I put something in the text box, yep, there we go. Our clear button the entire UI, right? So this is kind of the sell of reactive UI, in my opinion, is like I didn't have to go and write a whole bunch of complex code. You saw my view model. There's only 60 lines of code. In 60 lines of code, I'm able to go ahead and search for coffee, right? And see that there's data that ends up on my screen, right? I can get to these elements that are projected onto my screen, and I can reason about the state of my application, right? My application state in a reactive manner. So 6 lines of code or 60 lines of code got me all of this functionality, right? All of this behavior. And that's a very important thing. So I'm going to try this, and this may blow up in my face, but we're going to go for it anyway. Going to point out that, yeah, you'll notice that this exploded, right? I'm using a technology under the hood that we haven't talked about called dynamic data, which Reactive UI takes a dependency on. So if I observable and I observer, I enumerator and I enumerable, dynamic data bridges the gap between I observable and I enumerable. So you get the best of both worlds of those two interfaces on one data structure. So under the hood, I've got a source cache, which is actually caching this information under the hood. So it's actually going and doing a network request out to DuckDuckGo to get this information. And I'm caching that in an application level store. So that way, when I change this, I can just project the changed values from the internet. So yeah, you can see this is why we're the 11th best search engine in the world, because, we got a horribly buggy UI. But you can kind of see that I'm just typing into this search box and I'm getting search results. And that's the power of the reactive UI, right? Or the reactive framework, the reactive extensions. I'm not having to say, hey, go take this text change, go fire off and go do some stuff. Hey, it's doing all that for me just by saying, hey, he typed something in this box, go do the thing. He typed something else in this box, go do the thing. And you'll notice that it's responding to every single text change event that I'm sending in. So like if I type in 42, it's going to go and look for, it's going to tell me it's the number that follows 41 and 43. So it's giving me a lot of lift in the ability to reason about what happens in this text box without having to write a lot of code to get that to work. I mean, to do this same thing in an imperative manner, I feel like would take at least twice as much code.
Right. And then you also mentioned that dynamic data piece. So is that just built into Reactive UI? Is that like a package we got to install or something?
That is actually a separate package. So I've got links. Dynamic data is a separate package. It is operated, or it is maintained by the Reactive UI team, but it was written by a man named Roland Pheasant, who is like a literal genius. For him to have figured this out. So I'll go on record as saying this is probably like one of my favorite .NET libraries as of late. The way it's built, the power that it gives me in my applications, the cleanness of the architecture of the internal code in the library. It's amazing. But what it allows me to do is reason on changes of data. So to give you an understanding of kind of what's going on there, I kind of have to dig a little bit further into my MVVM view model. So you'll notice here I've got this execute search and I've got this query method. Well, this query method under the hood is calling out to remember we saw earlier that I had this iDuckDuckGo API client, which is just a refit REST client. So my REST client is making a network request. It's calling the search method, which we've defined here, right? And then I'm catching any exceptions that come from the query results. And then I'm basically saying, hey, select these results out as this other type. I'm going to point out this is a technique that I learned from another member of the community. So Rich, thanks for showing me the C# language extensions and giving me the understanding of how some of this works. And then I'm caching it inside my dynamic data cache, right? So this is my dynamic data cache, and I'm just caching it inside my cache. Right. So what this cache function does under the hood is then projects a brand new observable for whoever is listening. Right. I'm saying, hey, give me the result of whatever I put in my enumerable as a list of change sets. I think that in particular is beyond the scope of this particular conversation. But I am always open to talk about this. And I think that dynamic data is probably like one of the most underused libraries out there.
So you know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like you're saying you're going to come back on in another episode, we're going to talk about like some RX and some dynamic data stuff, because this sounds like really cool.
I mean, if you can suffer through another session of me, I'm willing to put the community through their paces and show them how dynamic data works. I feel like I'd be able to better show it in a Xamarin application, but it's universal across. Like it was, the first place that I saw it was a WPF application. And that's where most of the samples are. So, I'm basically creating an iObservable pipeline from my view model search. So let's talk about the code, right? Let's reason about the code. So you said it's declarative, right? And it's easy to read. The reason why I fell in love with RX is because it's easy to read and it's easy to reason about. It reads like prose. It reads like a good story, right? When any value, right? Anytime my search text changes, where the search information is not null, let's go ahead and trim that information. Let's escape the data based upon a URI schema, and then let's go ahead and execute our search. After we get search results back, let's pipe it out to a collection and let's bind it to the collection object that we want to present on the screen, right? It's very easy to reason about this one chunk of code and its responsibility for this view model. Now, I won't, again, this is a contrived example. I personally have seen view models that get upwards of 600 lines of RX code. Again, to me, a line of RX code is a single operator. So we're talking about calling a where clause as a line of code. Versus, a complicated line of code. So to me, this is very easy to read. This is very easy to reason about. I can look at this constructor and say, when this thing happens, when the application is in this state, I expect this thing to happen. Case in point, but our clear button, right? We're using a reactive command. I'm going to point out real quick, reactive command respects ICommand, but it also produces an observable. So I'm kind of cheating here and using some of the reactive UI goodness and saying, hey, I've got this reactive command, which is just an action, right? Just sends in an action, which is just an empty action to do the clear. So I'm basically just sending a signal from the UI that says to clear. I'm able to give my can execute logic as an observable. So basically, anytime that the search text is not null or empty, right, that means that this thing can execute. So we're taking the can execute of the clear button and piping it out to that can clear object, and that is then bound to the disable method on our button. So that's how we're getting that UI responding to the fact that our text our text box is empty, right? When the text box is empty, go ahead and tell us you can't execute. So that way the binding actually disables. But what I'm doing and what I'm, I'm kind of cheating here. I'm saying that, hey, when this notification happens, because reactive command returns an iObservable, which, as we said earlier, is just an event in the sense of a notification. Hey, this button got clicked. Now I can subscribe to the fact that the button got clicked, i.e. the command executed, completed execution, not just that it started, but that it completed execution. And I can then go clear out my search box. So to me, this is very easy to reason about because it's all right here in the constructor. It's all very easy to read. It's using link operations that I already know, plus some new ones that I may not know, to give a behavior to this view model. And that's a very interesting part, right? So like looking at that, right, I'm taking a .NET event. So this is where I'm going to point out that the technologies all play together, right? I'm taking a .NET iNotify property changed event, which is that text change event, and I am piping that into a network request. This is important, right? I'm taking a iNotify property changed event, and I'm not doing any type of, going back to this, right? I'm not doing any type of hard reasoning about it, right? I'm very easily taking that text input, piping it into my network request, which is done for me under the hood via refit, right? And I'm piping that out to the network, pulling it back in an observable pipeline. So now talking about API surface and having to reason about differences and things, I'm using one API surface, folks, to do everything, all the way from my view, all the way to my REST, my REST client and back again. There's no context switch. There's no hard to reason about nonsense. This is just all from one part. You can see it go from point A to point B and back to point A, right? And it's all in one consistent approach. And that to me is very powerful because, trying to figure out how to bridge a .NET event with a task completion source and then figure out when some network or some system notification is happening, it becomes very hard to do when you're dealing with it in an imperative manner. But when you're using the iObservable interface and reactive extensions and reactive UI, it becomes honestly child's play to go from the user interface text changed event all the way to results from an API request in, what's that, 6 lines of code?
Yeah, that's crazy.
Seems good to me.
It seems good to me too. So we got a bunch of questions coming in, a lot of questions. We're probably not going to get to all of these questions, but I want to make sure we answer some of them before we check out for the day.
Yeah, sure.
So real quick for Jose, let's bring Jose back in. And
Yeah,
he
sure.
asked, so do we need Prism when we're using Reactive UI? Do they work together, or are they separate, or like how does that work?
You do not need them. So one of the things that I like to rant about Reactive UI is there are multiples of MVVM frameworks out there currently, right? The main ones that are out there, and if I don't talk about yours, it's not because I don't know about it, it's just because I'm talking about the main ones. Prism, MVVM Cross, and in the Xamarin space, there's Fresh MVVM, right? Those are the 3 that I have seen used the most throughout my career as a Xamarin developer. I will say that if you try and use Prism with MVVM Cross, you're going to hit a wall very fast, right? What I like to point out to people about Reactive UI is it's a kind of a pay-to-play model, right? You don't have to use all of what Reactive UI offers to get value out of it, right? You can just use the win any value bits and get there. So it does work, and I've used it with Prism. I've used it with MVVM Cross, although that was not a production application. That was just a sample trying to play around to see how it would work. But Reactive UI plays nice in the sandbox with all the other major MVVM frameworks, and it is the only MVVM framework that can boast of that, right? Like we're the only ones that play nice in everybody else's sandbox. So we're very much like, hey, if you're using Prism and you want to use Reactive UI, go right ahead. If you want to use Reactive UI, just Reactive UI, this sample will show you how to do just that with Blazor. But it is very important to point out that you don't have to, but you can. And that's the fun part about Reactive UI to me is that, you know, if you just want to use the reactive bits, you can just use the reactive bits and you don't have to worry about using any of the other stuff you don't want to use.
Got it. And then last question we're going to take. I'm actually going to compound 2 questions into one a little bit. So so another question coming in from Jose, and he's asking about debugging tips for Reactive UI. But then we also had a question a little bit earlier about testing applications. So I don't know if you could kind of put them together. Like, how can we debug and test like our pipelines and, you know, some of these things that we build using reactive extensions?
So I'm going to do my best to not be bad at this real quick. No guarantees. Let's go ahead and bring this over and put this on the 3rd. Okay, so let's go ahead and just put a quick breakpoint here. So you'll notice that I'm able to put a breakpoint inside my select statement, right? So now because I have a breakpoint inside my select statement, when I debug the thing, hopefully I don't have debugging turned off, because that's something that I do is mute breakpoints quite frequently. I can actually debug directly in here. So debugging Reactive UI or reactive extensions is something that is hard for a lot of people because you have to invert your thinking, right? This code is not happening on line 34 where I wrote it. It's happening when the condition is correct, right? So notice, and let me go make sure that the debugging is all set. It looks like it is. Okay, cool. So the debugging is all set. So if I come in here and I start typing, fall down. What did I miss? Oh, well.
Is it debugging off?
Yeah, probably. Hold on. Let's go figure out. Yeah, there we go. It needs to get through all that stuff. There we go. So yeah, you'll notice that now I've hit my breakpoint on my select statement. So niceties like the method, the static method expressions right here, like where I'm using the method syntax. This actually makes it harder to debug, but you can put what we call a do statement, right? So, and I'm going to show you, I have because I do this quite often, right? I have a do statement, and I can just put a breakpoint right here and just verify that it's happening when it's supposed to happen. Now, from a testing the application perspective, reactive extensions, Reactive UI, and the MVVM portion of it is all inherently unit testable. So you can unit test everything in here with no problems. I've got some examples of that in some other code, and I won't kind of show it here, but it's inherently unit testable. You can test this reactive command. You can test time complexity. You can test the throttle happens exactly when it's supposed to happen. So if I say 500 milliseconds, I mean 500 milliseconds, and the test won't take an additional 500 milliseconds to execute. And that's the sell to me, is that if I have a 30-second timeout on a network request and I want to test that in a unit test, my unit test won't take an additional 30 seconds to execute. I don't have to do task.delay for 30 seconds. I can just swap out the scheduler on the throttle and say advance 30 seconds and everything will work. And it'll happen in a matter of milliseconds.
That's awesome. So we do have a bunch of folks that are asking, where can they find the code sample? Where is this code? They want to play with the bits. So do you have any?
They want to play with
on your GitHub?
bits. Yes, it is on my GitHub. So let's go ahead and find. Let's see. Can I find myself on GitHub? This is the hard part, right? Where is it? It's probably like the most recent repository that I changed because I pushed bits to it earlier. So I have a repository where I keep all of my talk information. It hasn't been merged to master yet, but there is going to be a place in here, and I'll go ahead and just give folks the folder on this branch, and I'll leave the branch out here for a couple of days to make it easy for folks to find. But somewhere in here, let's just go ahead and make this big so I can see what I'm doing. In here where I have Reactive UI and on .NET, I have a Blazor server-side sample. And in this Blazor server-side sample, you can get access to it. So this is right here on my public GitHub under talks. It's under the on .NET on the feature Blazor. I'll merge it into master probably shortly after we get off of here for everybody so that you can just go to the on.net, look at the bang.server-side and go ahead and play with the bits. There's also some Reactive UI samples. So going back to, and I know we're running up against the mythical time wall, but there's also some samples out here, and we've got our samples kind of organized based upon the platform. So we've got a Blazor example out here for server side, client side, and hosted ASP.NET Core to kind of give you an understanding of how that works. So there's a lot of examples out here. If you reach out to me either on Twitter at rlittlesII, or in the Reactive UI Slack, I can get you some more examples. I've been really over the past couple of years been trying to create as many real world examples as possible around RX, because what I hear is from a lot of folks in the community is RX is a fringe technology. Nobody really uses it. It's not good for production applications. I will tell you that if you aren't building specifically, event-driven applications using RX, you are missing the boat.
Yeah. And so, like you said, Rodney, like if folks want to reach out to you, like there's your Twitter handle right there, right under your name there, awesome. Right? So definitely reach out to Rodney on Twitter. Here's his GitHub repo right there. Follow him on GitHub. You can follow people on GitHub. A lot of people don't know that, but you can follow people on GitHub. So you can see as he's pushing changes to this repo, and definitely make sure you go ahead and check out those samples. And also, I think kind of like what you mentioned, Rodney, like, you've been trying to put more samples for Blazor and things of that nature. That's a great opportunity for all of you in the community. If you want to learn Blazor and Reactive UI together, like suggest a sample, go ahead, contribute it. Like that's what open source is all about, right? Like you learn and you can help other people learn while you're along the way. So I think that's a great thing for folks to do. Also, if y'all want Rodney to come back on and talk about dynamic data, I know I want him to come back on, but if y'all wanted to come back on and talk about dynamic data, go ahead and like drop some comments in the chat. If I see enough, that I'll make sure that, we'll have him come back on, and, maybe we'll do like a Xamarin and reactive data talk like sometime a little bit later in the year. But with that being said, Rodney, do you have anything you want to say before
one more thing, right? So we talked about MVU today. We talked about MVVM, and it's like, okay, great. You can use Reactive UI to create Blazor. Why, Rodney, would I ever do that in a normal, world? Well, the Reactive UI has been trying to bolster a lot of its offerings. One of the places where we haven't done so well in the past is with cross-platform navigation. So there's a library out here called Sextant, which is going to be our new offering for navigation. And so you'll see this gentleman right here, Lee McPherson, contributed a Blazor navigation extension for Sextant. So now you can use Sextant, a navigation library, to navigate in Xamarin Forms and Blazor. So what does that mean? That means that I can write my view models once against a single abstraction and use them in Xamarin Forms. In the future, it'll be WPF, Blazor, and I can write my application once, right? Like this is the cell, right? I can write my application once. I can write my application logic in my view models, and then I can share those view models across any UI that I want. So to me, that's the sell, right? When we're talking about .NET, this one .NET concept, this .NET everywhere concept, it becomes, can I really build an application once and use it everywhere? I will say that I have worked on some Prism bits around doing Prism in Blazor, so I know that it does work and is possible. So folks understand that what we're really talking about here today with Reactive UI and Blazor isn't just the concept of being able to do, Reactive UI and Blazor. It's being able to deliver a single application, right? I.e. the view model layer, put any UI on top of it that I want to, and it works. That's the sell. And that's kind of the dream that we're working towards.
Got it. And then like you're showing right here, like this is also on GitHub. The repo's here. It's the code is here. So again, this is what community is all about, right? Like go ahead, check it out, submit some issues, try it out in your own apps. Let us know what you think about it so that, Rodney and the rest of his team could, continue to improve it and make sure that it does the things that you want it to do and add value to your workflow every day.
Yes.
Cool. Well, folks, again, thank you all so much. Really appreciate you all joining us again for this week for on.NET Live. We'll be back again next week. Next week, I think it'll be like July 1st. I'm not sure, but I think it'll be July next week.
It will be.
Yeah, it will be. I don't have a calendar in front of me, but it's going to be July next week. So we're going to have tons more great stuff happening in the month of July. Definitely recommend you check out tomorrow. We'll be doing that Let's Learn Blazor event here on this channel and also on Learn TV. And like I said before, if you want to reach out to Rodney, follow him on GitHub, follow him on social media, and send over your questions so you can learn all the great stuff about Reactive UI. So that being said, I'm going to check out. We're going to check out, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everybody.